Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I'm so delighted to be here today with author Susan Rebecca White. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's truly my pleasure. Susan Rebecca White is the author of four novels: Bound South, A Soft Place to Land, A Place at the Table, and this beautiful book I have in my hand, We Are All Good People Here. This is the hardcover copy, and it comes out in paperback March 3rd. And Susan, you have the paperback handy, and I think it has also a beautiful cover. Go ahead and
I
show us
do.
that
It's a very
paperback.
different cover, but here is the cover of the paperback.
Oh, so beautiful. So
Oh,
excited.
thank
So
you.
we are all good people here, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Susan is also a graduate of Brown University and the MFA program at Hollins University. She has taught creative writing at Hollins, Emory, as well as other places. She is an Atlanta native and currently lives in Atlanta with her husband and son. So much good stuff to talk about. But let's start with We Are All Good People Here. Please tell me about the book.
Okay, so it's about a friendship. At its heart, it's about a friendship between two women, Daniella Gold and Eve Whalen, and they meet for the first time when they're 18 as college roommates at what was very much a girls' school at that time. It was in 1962. They're sort of randomly paired to live together, but they form this instant bond. And the novel follows them through 30 years of friendship, and it follows them through their political awakenings, their different directions that these political awakenings take them, through the sort of the middle of their marriages and the middle of their lives, and then becoming mothers, and then their own daughters becoming kind of best friends of their own. And so its heart is this friendship between these two women, but it's also asking a lot of questions about American history, social justice, how we pursue social justice, how we evaluate who we are in the context that we're currently living in. You know, what you might say about yourself looking back 20 years ago. And how we try to hold on to people that we love, even when we become very different or ideological divides come up that feel almost too wide to breach, not to breach, to cross.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is like both an old question and a really current question.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so you
yeah,
mentioned that this book spans the early 1960s into the early 1990s. So a pretty rich historical place, like you said, in terms of the civil rights movement and some of these social justice questions, the Vietnam War. Tell me about why you decided to set the book in that context and what that history really did alongside the writing of the book.
yeah. Well, I was always really interested. So I was a child of, I was born in 75. And it's interesting when I think about it because the tumult of the late 60s and early 70s had just ended, but it it was very fresh. I think it was still being talked about a lot or narrated a lot. I grew up with the 60s very sort of much in my imagination. And then when I was like 24, like 20 years ago, I watched this documentary called The Weather Underground. And it was about this radical offshoot of Students for Democratic Society that had decided, basically their motto was bring the Vietnam War home, that were bombing Vietnam, and their feeling was, we're going to force the government to look at what they're doing by setting bombs off in the United States. And it was this really militant, radical, violent group. And I watched this documentary about them, and I was completely fascinated. And the thing I was most fascinated by was listening to the former members who are now in their 60s talking about their perception of their past involvement. And some of the people were like, we were no different than the terrorists who flew the planes into the towers, the Twin Towers. And others were like, you cannot understand what the world was like in that time. You cannot judge us from this era without knowing what it was like then. And then others were like, we were completely right. We made tactical errors, but we were completely right. And I was just really interested in how we look back on history and how we evaluate our youth. And so I think that really sort of spurred the questions of this book, but I didn't come to write it till 10 years later.
So it had a really good marination period as you really thought about those questions and as it came to
really
life.
did.
Yeah. Oh, that's so fascinating. And so you mentioned the Weather Underground, but also at play in the book is the civil rights movement and some of
For
these
sure.
really dynamic racial questions that were happening at that time and continue on to today. And in fact,
For
like
sure.
really early on in the book, like I think very first chapter, your two characters, Daniella and Eve, are having a conversation about that. And I'm just going to read your own words back to you if you'll bear with me. So Daniela responded that Southern manners helped keep segregation in place. My dad says it's all part of an elaborate code to keep the racial lines firmly drawn. That's not true, said Eve. Manners are about making other people feel at ease. And I feel like that little bit of dialogue between Daniela and Eve is just a really interesting question about both this question of manners, this question of like how we expect people to act, and this also really pressing concern about how do we act when that's not right, when social justice, when we need to stand up. So talk to me a little bit about how you played with that in the book, and especially too as we think about like your really interesting title, which is We Are All Good People Here, right? And so manners is sort of like making space for like, oh, we're assuming the best, but what if the best isn't, what if that's not right? And that's where social justice comes in.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's something I really struggle with because, I mean, just in my own life, you know, so I'm super involved in my like very progressive lefty church. And something that helps me is I often think like we're mandated, we're asked to love our enemies. We're asked not to demonize anyone. And yet there's also that time when Jesus goes into the temple and they're selling things. They've sort of made the temple into this like marketplace, like just total commerce marketplace. And he's like, gets a whip and he's throwing down stuff. And so he's, throwing out everything and turning over tables. And so I have this thought of there is a genuine and true place for righteous anger and indignation. And I think it kills us to not treat others as if they are humans with souls who matter. So that's sort of the sort of personal struggle that I have is how do I approach things that are, to me, very clearly morally wrong without dehumanizing the person who I think is doing these dehumanizing acts? A huge question. I don't know how to answer it, but it's something I struggle with. In terms of like the Southern codes that Daniela was talking about, I think she's onto something. I mean, I grew up in this very sort of mannered world. I grew up in a part of Atlanta that was kind of old money and predominantly white, lots of big houses with mostly white residents and mostly Black housekeepers. And there was it was very mannered and very kind and in many ways very exploitive. And I think that the exploitation can be packaged easily under wonderful manners. And so I do think that there's a place to question that. But that said, I also think kindness is really important.
Sure.
So I guess it's sort of, I guess maybe it's the spirit of the kindness. Is the kindness there because you're just trying to make sure everything stays okay and everything looks okay and nothing gets disturbed? Or is the kindness because you genuinely want to see sort of the good, the spark of the divine in everyone?
Oh, such interesting questions. And I think that is sort of like a pretty key conflict. And what's really great is fiction makes such a really lovely playground for all that too, right? That you can have these two characters in questions. You can have a character who's really pushing the envelope and going a little bit more radical, while one is maybe following more of the societal norms, and see what that is like in interplay, which is what you do. And We Are All Good People Here. And so it makes such a fertile ground for asking some of those questions and sitting with what feels like contradiction, but is also the contradiction we live in. So that's really, really compelling.
Yeah, thank you. I know it is true because it is not like I have come up with the answer to these questions. I just have these characters who I love, who I can play out the questions in their lives and then see where it falls.
Right, which gives us some safety as readers too, because then we can watch them how they play with it. But it maybe we don't need to like, go in and burn down the temple, right? Like we can
Totally.
kind of imagine it, which is so great. And actually, like speaking of reading, as I was preparing for our interview, I found a really lovely quote that you gave, gosh, back in 2013. So the question was about like why so many writers love really good food. And in the
Mm.
end of your answer to that, you said, and then there's probably also the metaphoric connection between reading as feeding the soul, reading as letting you survive. And I just love this
Mm.
quote. And I think that reading is just this like really fundamental, like really lovely, almost like survival instinct that we have. Can you like riff a little bit more about that? Like tell me more about why you feel like reading feeds the soul.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's just such an interesting thing because coming from the side of the writer, I know how many hours of solitude and work and editing and thinking putting together this book does. And it's an act that's done so alone. And yet it really isn't finished until someone else reads it. And then someone else reads it, and they might have a very different take on what you thought you were doing. And I would argue that as long as they're using the context of the book, their take is as valid, that it becomes a gift. No long a book is no longer your own. It's something that you gift, that you put out. And so there's this intimacy, I think, that we all need, that comes from reading. And it's so different than, the flashing bright lights of sort of screen culture that we're in. You can get lost in a book. You're not being interrupted by another buzz or another beep or another comment coming in. It's a very intimate experience. And I think that that's something we sort of desperately need right now. And then there's also the piece of just empathy. You're just diving deep into someone else's world and someone else's mind. And I have a 5-year-old, and the thing that seems like the biggest job that I have is to help him learn to be empathic and kind. And the way that I do that the most is through books. Even when there was one time when he was like 3 and he has his best friend and he didn't want to play. He didn't want to let other kids play with them. And I was like, we need to get some books that discuss this and that discuss
Yeah.
and so I even find books kind of in this kind of basic stage with my son is like teaching you how to be a better human. And now my books, of course, my books that I write are not, I don't think that they are moralistic, and they certainly don't shy from really dark territory. But I think that going inside of stories that you might normally just judge from a distance, it just helps us be better humans.
Absolutely, because you're right, because it gets us into that gray area, right? Where I feel like
Yeah.
often with our screen culture, everything wants to be black and white. Everything wants to be the thing that's shared, the thing that's retweeted, the thing that gets out there. And a lot of times those are really simple, really negative headlines. And it just doesn't get into the like human element of like, what did it take to get to that really dark moment? What did it take, for all of those circumstances to come together? Because that's not a short story. It's a novel. It's the story of our
Totally.
history. And so you're right. So fiction does create that really interesting play of creating gray, where oftentimes we feel really pulled to black and white, which I think is also really refreshing because it gives us permission to be really gray humans too, right? Like none of
Yeah,
us are all good or all bad, right? There's always a lot mixed in.
totally. And I would say that I feel very much like, in terms of the title of the book, like, we're all good people here. And sometimes we're not, like
Totally. Yes, 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 indeed. That might be like a blessing to everyone watching. Like, we are all good people and we're not, and that's totally okay. Like, permission for all you bring, right? Like, that is great. That is great. Um, So for my last question, you live in Atlanta and were born in Atlanta and, kind of are part of this Southern literature tradition. I also read that in high school you loved reading All the King's Men, which is also part of that Southern
Mm.
tradition. One of my all-time favorite books, by Robert Penn Warren. I read it every few years as like going back to an old friend. So I wonder if you could just like riff a little bit on, this traditional Southern literature, like how you feel like your writing fits in, yeah, and what you're hoping readers will walk away with it, whether they're from the South or whether they're not from the South.
Yeah. Um, okay, so to start with All the King's Men, for me, it was the first book that I felt like I really was changed by. And I was reading it and I was 18 years old and I was having a somewhat of a racial and political awakening that year because of a class that I was taking, called Two Visions, where that's a tangent. But I was going through a sort of political and racial awakening myself. And All the King's Men, the thing about it was this idea that everything's connected, that you can't cut yourself off from history, that something that happened 100 years ago is still going to affect us today. And this idea that you can try to stay as pure and untouched as you can, and you can't do it. I think it's Adam who is
Mm-hmm.
he can't do it. He wants
Yeah.
to, and he can't do it.
Yeah.
And that was, it's interesting because that sort of idea directly affects the book We Are All Good People Here. I never thought about that until we were just talking about it. But so that was one of those books that when I first was assigned to read it, it felt kind of impenetrable. And then I was reading it and I was like, oh, I think I see something I haven't seen before. So it just had this like really deep imprint on me. So that was really, really powerful. In terms of being a Southern writer, yeah, I'm from Atlanta. It is what I write about. It is what I know. Atlanta is a really interesting Southern city in that when you talk about the core city, it's progressive. Like my neighborhood, if you look at voting patterns in my neighborhood, like we vote the same way that the Upper West Side votes. So, so like there's these stereotypes of the white South, and that's probably true, but it's not exactly true of Atlanta. And so that's always been an interesting part of the South for me to try to explore. And I also kind of feel this onus. There is, I think, a lot of sort of dangerous mythologizing about white Southern culture. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to mythologize Moonlight and Magnolias without looking at like the exploitative labor practices that provided that system. And so I feel like the South in all of its beauty and depravity is something that I should be writing about. And luckily I'm really interested in it. So it's what I want to be writing about. But so
Sure.
that's the South for me.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. And it's interesting how well tied it is to everything we've talked about so far, right? Some of that gray and trying to get like all of the stories, right? Because there's not just one story for, white folks in the South, right? And so like
Yeah.
teasing out what all of those different variations can look like.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so very much for like diving into those like really rich creative waters, for creating and writing We Are All Good People Here, out in paperback March 3rd. Must readers, please do check it out. And Susan Rebecca White, thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you so much. It's been so lovely.